All right, just a reminder to everybody, we are doing the Christmas boxes with Samaritan Purse. Boxes are out there. Um, You need to get those done because remember, November 14th is when we need to have them here at the church. We will dedicate them and then they go to the collection point that week. So it sounds like it's a long way off, but it's not a long ways off. It's actually about 5 weeks, not quite 5 weeks. And so if you're going to do it, you need to do that. We do have some things that we can add to it. So if you don't have a box that's completely full, we can add some things to it. But anyhow, there's some who will be packing the box and going ahead and paying for their box. There's some people that can pack a box, but it may be hard for them to send it. We have people who are not packing boxes, but they have money, and so they're giving money to make sure the boxes get sent. So there's all kinds of options. So again, just reminding you of the Christmas boxes. Okay. Also remind you that Wednesday night, October 27th, we will be having a cookout in the back. The church will provide the meat and the drinks. And basically, if you're coming, bring something that goes with, we're probably going to do hot dogs. And then, of course, by request, we will have plenty of the best of the West beans. And whatever else goes with that, we'll at least have hot dogs and beans and drinks. The rest is on you. So anyhow, October 27th, all right? Okay, with that being said, we are in our study in Esther. So if you'll take your Bibles and turn to Esther. Everybody here tonight, do you have, I know Lana wasn't here last week, so you don't have a handout, the outline. And I know that people are going, I know they disappeared from the screen. It's all right. It's all good. All right. So we covered chapter 1 last week, and we spent time because most of what chapter 1 was about had to do with the king. You needed to know who the king was and what he was like. And so as we looked at King Ahasuerus, we know that he was a king who was very arrogant. And so he spent a lot of time doing a lot of stuff that was very extravagant. And because of his arrogance, he was easily manipulated by a lot of men who were seeking power. He spent about 6 months working with his leadership, going and having them come and visit him during that time. And then he threw the big banquet, which lasted about a week. The plans were so that they could go and invade Greece and then move on up through Europe. That's what he wanted to do. They all agreed. And so that's what they were going to do. In this party, we also see that he had a problem because drinking was just one of those things. Let's just drink and we don't have to pay attention to anything. And drunkenness was very rampant in this banquet that he had. And so much so that he ends up calling for his queen, Vashti, to come and parade her beauty before all these drunk guys, of which she refused. Which that showed us another part of not only was he arrogant and he was prone to get drunk, but he also had an anger problem. And he got very angry, and that makes him do all kinds of things. And So he turns to his advisors. His advisors say, you can't let her get away with this, because if you let her get away with this, and all the women in the whole kingdom are going to know that the queen did this, and then they're not going to listen to their husbands, and we're going to have a big mess. And so you need to do something. And so he chooses to listen to them and be very vindictive. And his vindictiveness was that he ends up having her basically exiled, so to speak. She's isolated. She's no longer allowed to come in his presence, no longer to be in the presence, even at the palace. And so she's gone. And so we see that this is the king. This is the guy who's in charge. And he is going to be a player in this story. And so we need to know he's going to be a player in the story. This is what he's like. He's arrogant, prone to being drunk. He has an anger issue. And if you don't do what he wants, he can be vindictive.
I saw him more of being stupid than anything else. Stupid with some pride because of his position. Stupid because he listened to other people because he couldn't think of his own self. Okay, she didn't come, so I should be mad, but what do I do? So he listened to counselors who were putting themselves up in front.
And that's that phrase where they understood the times. In verse 13, the wise men who understood the times. Because again, he listened to him, and I agree with you. Basically, everything that I've read on this king, he is not the sharpest knife in the drawer. He is just, he's not too smart, and he's a king simply because he was born into a royal family, and he's managed to be able to hold on to things so far.
He just realized
Yeah. And with that being said, we jump into chapter 2. Chapter 2, the first verse says, sometime later, when King Ahasuerus' rage had cooled down, he remembered Vashti, what she had done, and what was decided against her. Now, here's the other thing. When we look at this sometime later, this sometime later is very interesting because there's a lot that has taken place between the time that he goes away with Vashti and he now comes to this point. It actually is almost like 2 years. Because he becomes king in 83. He's already talking to these things. And so in 480 BC, he starts his campaign and launches to be able to start war. And his navy is completely wiped out at Salamis. That was in 480 BC. He no longer has an army, a navy. Then in 479 BC, his army is wiped out at Plataea, Plataea. So now his navy has been wiped out, his army has been wiped out, and so now he has kind of slinked back to Susa, which is his winter palace, and he's hurting because all his plans that he had to be able to go and to take over Greece and move up into Europe have been pretty much smashed because he has no navy left and he has no army. Okay, so then he comes back in here, so he's feeling bad. He's feeling lonely. And so, of course, he's feeling lonely, so it makes him have to start thinking about his queen. And now that he's had a lot of time to think about it, he kind of now is thinking about it. But here's the problem with the Medes and the Persians. See, he made a declaration, he made a decree. And one of the things I always liked about the Medes and the Persians, basically, they weren't very smart people. If we make a decree that obviously is a bad decree, then we should be able to override that decree. But in the Medes and the Persians, if they make a decree, they can't override, they can't change their mind on a decree. They have to let the decree play out, and then they do whatever adjustment they need to make. Kind of goofy, but that's what they do. And so he's made this decree, and in reality, he really would like to have had her come because she was the queen for a reason. And we're going to be looking at that as we look at chapter 2, because as he's going to start looking for her replacement, as we look at this, again, we're going to see how fickle he is. And you really need to get this of how he really is, because it shows the greatness of God, how God can work all this, even with a guy who is as Isaiah is sitting, is an idiot, a royal idiot, because he does. I mean, so far as we've looked, he's not really made a whole lot of good choices to be in charge of an empire. But you can also see that's one of the reasons why you see that, when you look at Daniel's dream, you had Nebuchadnezzar, and then you had the Medes and the Persians, and then who comes next? The one country that he's wanted to wipe out, which is Greece, because then Greece comes in and ends up taking care of the Medes and the Persians, but it takes time. So.
He couldn't really avoid Vashti because that's still, she has this child.
Yes, which that's the other thing, and I'm glad you mentioned that. Because one of the reasons why, and I mentioned that last week, and I didn't have it written down on my thing, so I had to make myself a note, and I almost forgot again till Brother Isaiah reminded me. One of the reasons why Vashti may not have wanted to parade in front of all these guys is because there's a good possibility she was pregnant. Most scholars, as they look, because his son Artaxerxes is born, in basically 80, in 83, somewhere in that time frame. So they're thinking that there may have been. Then she is disposed of and put. She wasn't killed, but she just no longer has any influence until after Ahasuerus dies and his son Artaxerxes becomes king. And then when we see that, we see she has a different name. Many scholars think this woman is still Vashti, and the new name would be Amestris, Amestris. Many scholars believe that she actually is the mother of the king, because it describes her as the mother of the king, but that it's Vashti. And so she ends up helping run the kingdom from behind the scenes. And Artaxerxes is important to us because he rules from 464 to 425 BC, but he is responsible for the exiles who end up returning with Ezra and with Nehemiah. So that's where they fit in regards to the Persian Empire. So Esther is actually first, and Esther's going to do her thing as we look at this. And then when the son becomes king, then he's going to end up allowing Ezra to go with the group, and then Nehemiah is going to go with the group back to Jerusalem. Okay? So, Dreamer.
Yeah, I've read where Esther was queen for very long.
More than likely, she probably was not. And again, when you're dealing with a man like he is, you could just say the wrong thing and that, he's done with you. And we're going to see some of that in this chapter because, again, this chapter kind of presents some problems for some people because they're sitting there going, how can God allow this to happen? Well, sin entered in the world. God knew sin entering the world. God has his plan on how he's going to take care of sin. And that was going to be taken care of in his son, Jesus Christ, who would come and would die on a cross, be buried, and rise again, rise from the dead. And so therefore, salvation would be secured. But at this point, God's still working his plan, moving that way. So as we're moving that way, we have a lot of promises. And again, it goes back to some of the covenants that we've already talked about. Because when you sit down and you look at the covenants, God is going to work in this whole mess, and he's going to protect his people. But he protects his people because of, one, he wants the world to know what he has said. So his word is going to go forth. But the second thing is so that his son would come and bring salvation to the world. And he's already promised that, because he promised that in Genesis 12 to Abraham, or Abram. That was the covenant they made. So we look at the Abrahamic covenant. That was part of what it was, is that he would be a blessing to the world, because through him was going to become the one who is going to be that deliverer. So he's already talked about that was what was going to happen. And it also has to do with, if you go to Galatians chapter 3, again, Paul, of all people, explains this because it needed to be explained. And he's writing to the church of Galatia, which is primarily made up of Gentiles, but there are some Jews, but he's helping them understand this is what you need to know. Beginning in verse 7 of Galatians chapter 3, he actually, verse 6 says, just as Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him for righteousness, so understand that those who have faith are Abraham's sons. Now the scripture foresaw that God would justify the Gentiles by faith, and foretold the good news to Abraham, saying, all nations will be blessed in you. So those who have faith are blessed with Abraham, who had faith. For all who rely on the works of the law are under a curse. Because it's written, curses everyone who does not continually do everything written in the book of the law. So Paul's once again walking in here, and Paul should know. Paul was a Pharisee. Paul knew the word. But Paul's saying that if you were counting on being able to have you living the complete word and therefore being found perfect, it's not going to happen, because again, if you broke one little tiny bit of the law, you were guilty of breaking the whole law, and so you were cursed. You were under that condemnation that was there. And so he says, this is what it is in verse 11. Now it is clear that no one is justified before God by the law, because the righteous will live by faith. And we've worked through that, because again, that's a quote from Habakkuk. And then you go back and we look at Romans, and we also look at Hebrews. So all these come in there, and it talks about the righteous live by faith. We have faith in God that God is going to accomplish what God says he's going to do. Now, this is important because we're looking at Esther, and we're looking at all the things that are going to develop. And then we look at today. Today, we've already talked about some of tonight. We've got all kinds of messes going on. Things that we cannot control. But God has not lost control. And God is going to continue to work his plan. And how we come through it the way we need to come through it is that we live by faith. That's what we have to do. We have to trust that God is still in charge, and God will tell us what we need to do and how we need to live. So as he goes on, he goes with that, verse 12, but the law is not based on faith. Instead, the one who does these things will live by them. Christ has redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us, because it is written, curses everyone who hung on a tree. And the purpose was that the blessing of Abraham would come to the Gentiles in Christ Jesus, so we would receive the promise of the Spirit through faith. Brothers, I'm using a human illustration. No one sets aside even a human covenant that has been ratified or makes additions to it. Now the promise we were spoken to Abraham and to his seed. He does not say and to seeds, as though referring to many, and to your seed, referring to one who is in Christ. And I say this, the law, which came 430 years later, does not revoke a covenant that was previously ratified by God so as to cancel the promise. For if the inheritance from the law is no longer from the promise, but God granted it to Abraham through the promise. So again, he's basically saying what I have already said, is that God already made a promise. God's already ratified his promises in some of these covenants. And as he continues to move it, now we're where we see the new covenant. The new covenant has definitely been ratified because Christ has accomplished what he needed to do on the cross. And so those who believe in Christ now come to him. They now have the ability to be able to live the way that God would have them to live because now they're in Christ and they have all these resources that they need to be able to do so. Because that's how God designed it. But God was working in this time period where there is a threat because the evil one constantly was trying to make sure he could mess up what he thought was God's plan so that it would not be accomplished. And so one of the best ways to be able to do that as we look in this book and as we continue is let's annihilate the Jews. If we annihilate the Jews and there is no more Jews, then how is the Abraham covenant going to be fulfilled? Now, here's the thing. For me, even if all the Jews got annihilated, God would still find a way of being able to do that. I don't know how you do it, but God didn't have that happen. Instead, he had ways of where he protected his people, and we see that going over and over and over again. So, anyhow, so we have this backdrop. And so the king has been defeated silently in major battles. He's back at the Winter Palace. He is lonely. He's dejected. He's sad. He needs some encouragement. And actually, he thinks about his queen, Vashti. So that also tells you that there probably was a little more of a relationship other than she just every once in a while came to him, that there actually probably was some type of relationship. And he really did like talking with her. And because of his anger, his foolishness, he allowed that to be disrupted.
He obviously took care of her anyways.
Yeah.
The kingdom, so.
Yeah. And this is another one of those things when we talk about relationships. Relationships take work. And this is the other reason why throughout the Bible, we always keep hearing, don't let your anger go down. Don't let the sun go down and your anger still be burning. You need to take care of those things. And as it talks about even the relationship of husbands and wives, that submission that has to be there. These things are very important because those relationships, there's more to them than in most cases, like when we look at this, you can't get around it. A lot of it has to do with sex. This guy needed, sex all the time. I mean, that's what we're going to be looking at in chapter 2. I mean, that's what he's going to be doing because to him, that's what solved the problem. And guess what? We live in a world that pretty much says the same thing. It doesn't, because it's not the way that God designed things. And when we do things the way God designed them, then they work and they do what needs to be done. Then you start hearing about people who have been married for all these long years and to see, that, they went through a whole lot of stuff. And yeah, it would have been easy to say, well, I'm just tired of you and let me just get rid of you. And that didn't happen. They were able to walk through it. But it takes both parties to be like that. That's the other thing that I have a lot of times when I have to counsel married couples is if one of them is not open to counseling, it makes it very hard because you have to have both seeing that you have to work at this relationship. So anyhow, verse 2 says the king's personal attendants suggested. So here it is that they're looking at him being dejected and thinking about Vashti. And so they're going to try to make their life easier because they're the attendants. Okay, so just think about this. You're having to attend to a king who is not in a good mood. Who wants to go to work and do that? That's the thing. That's what they're looking. So they said, let a search be made for beautiful young virgins for the king. Now notice that it has to be beautiful young virgins, and the reason why is because he's a king. So nobody can ever have this woman before he has it. That's the criteria. So again, we're looking at that. Verse 3. Let the king appoint commissioners in each province of his kingdom so that they may assemble all the beautiful young virgins to the harem at the fortress of Susa. Put them under the care of Hegai, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women, and give them the required beauty treatments. Then the young woman who pleases the king will reign in the place of Vashti. This suggestion pleased the king, and he did accordingly. So here it is, as we talked about last week. He has this super extravagant mindset that this is how things got to go. So what he's going to do, it's not enough just to look in this providence and see if we can find a few beautiful young virgins. No, we're going through the whole kingdom, and every one of my commissioners, my representatives in these provinces are going to go through their whole provinces, and they're going to find all these beautiful young virgins, and they're going to gather them all up, and they're going to ship them to Susa, and then we're going to begin their beauty treatments. And the beauty treatments, let me tell you something. Their beauty treatments lasted for a year. I was reading on this in morning commentaries. These women had to go in there, and I think the first 6 months they had to be something bathed every day or multiple times a day in lavender or some type of essential oils and everything else because they had to smell right. And then the next 6 months, they would have another type of thing, and that's what they were going to do. So every one of these that have been gathered up have to come to this palace, and they have to go through the next year of being all this beauty treatments before they're ever presented to the king. And he hadn't even met them yet. Can you imagine that? I mean, this is what's happening. And what does that do to the kingdom? Well, see, every one of these young girls are all getting yanked out of their villages and their towns. And so here it is, they're being pulled, and you're saying, oh, well, this sounds good. You know, they're going to be in the palace and they're going. No, it was a life sentence of isolation because guess what? The best you were going to get unless you became queen was you would get one night with the king and that's it. And then you would be put away and you would be taken care of, but you're not allowed to marry anybody. You're not allowed to have any kids because guess what? You belong to the king. That's what's going on here. And so, ladies, really one of the great things that Christianity has done for women is it has definitely has shown that women are not sex objects, they're not slaves, they're not there to just please men and that's it, because that's not how God designed them. They were designed to help as helpmates and to be able to go. But these poor girls, once they've been found and they've actually made the trip to Susa, their lives now are, we may have nice clothes, we may have that, but as far as have freedom, as far as be able to have a family, as far as have any other type of relationship with someone who would love them, it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. There's no choice because they're living in a time period where there's no choice because women at that point are property. And so as we look at this, he's pleased with this. So in verse 5, a Jewish man was in the fortress of Susa named Mordecai, son of Jair, son of Shimei, son of Kish, a Benjamite. Now, it's important that they put all this because this is going to become, there's going to be a lot of play of this in chapter 3. Because who else also was a Benjamite? King Saul. And as we get into chapter 3, you're going to see there's going to be those things that are going to be playing in the two stories as we jump back to 1 Samuel and as we continue in Esther. So he is a Benjamite. He had been taken into exile from Jerusalem with the other captives when King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon took King Jeconiah of Judah into exile. And Mordecai was the legal guardian of his cousin, Handesha, that is Esther, because she didn't have a father or a mother. So let's just stop here. Here's what we do. We have two more people that have been put in here. One is Mordecai, who we know is a Benjamite. And so he has come and he is there. He has been brought in and he came in. And it's interesting, it says that he came in with other captives when King Nebuchadnezzar was in Babylon. Now, that doesn't mean that he was in the first group with Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, but it does mean that he was in one of the other groups that came while Nebuchadnezzar still was king. So that's an interesting thing, because here's the other history part of what we see is that when it comes time to go back to Jerusalem, there's only probably about 50, 60,000 Jews that actually go back. The rest of them all stay in Persia because they have now gotten property. They now have positions. They have businesses. They're not leaving. They're staying. So Mordecai is there. And so as I kind of identifying him, that he has this overlap. So there is some of that which he knows of what, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego have done. So there is some of that that's there. So keep that in mind. But he goes on. Mordecai was the legal guardian, and because now Esther, she didn't have a father and a mother. So here's a child that basically has been hit hard, is that not only is she in a foreign land, but she's in a foreign land, and she is the guardian, she is the custodian. Yeah, she is. What would that make her be? Anyhow, she belongs to Mordecai. Mordecai is her guardian. He's taking care of her because she has no parents. But it's her cousin, but he has that guardianship. And so he is now taking care of her. And then it says, and the young woman had a beautiful figure and was extremely good looking. And when her father and mother died, Mordecai had adopted her as his own daughter. So again, it lets us know that she's good looking. So she's one of these ones who has been gathered up to go to the palace, to go to Susa. Okay? So this is the scenario that's going on. So she basically has no family other than her cousin, Mordecai. And then it also, she's beautiful. And now she falls into this. She's now heading to the king. So in verse 8, when the king's command and edict became public knowledge, many young women gathered at the fortress of Susa under Gaia's care, and Esther was also taken to the palace and placed under the care of Hegai, who was in charge of the women. And the young woman pleased him and gained his favor. So here's the other thing where we start seeing where God's not mentioned, but God is working. Because it says here that she's placed under this eunuch and she finds favor. So that he accelerated the process of the beauty treatments and the special diet that she received. And he assigned 7 hand-picked female servants to her from the palace and transferred her to her servants and her servants to the harems best quarters. So because she found favor, here's what happens. He handpicks the servants that are going to serve her, be her ladies in waiting, so to speak. He's accelerated her beauty treatments. He's made sure that she has a special diet, and he also makes sure she has the best living quarters. Now, have we seen where God has his hand on an individual and does that kind of stuff before? Daniel was one. Joseph was another. As we see, when God has got his plan and he has his individuals, and although everybody else is looking at him and say, okay, we really don't see anything really spectacular, but God has a plan, and so God steps in and God does things, and some of the things that he does is he allows them to find favor with those who can control what is going to happen to them. And so in this case, Esther has been given to this chief eunuch, and he has made sure she has the best of everything.
Working one step ahead of Satan.
Yep, working one step ahead of Satan. So she has all this. So now, verse 10. Esther did not reveal her ethnic background on her birthplace because Mordecai had ordered her not to. Now, this is where a lot of times we wrestle in, and we wrestle with this whole thing. They're in a foreign country. And what we're going to find out is that for the most part, the reason why a lot of this works is because nobody knows Mordecai's a Jew and nobody knows Esther's a Jew. Now, that creates some problems, because what made Jews stand out among most people if they were practicing Jews? Do what? Well, with a male, it would have been circumcision, but, well, they only had one God, but there were some things that would definitely give you away if you were doing it. Go back to Daniel, chapter 1. Their diet. The law had all kinds of restrictions on what they were supposed to eat, not eat, how they were supposed to do all kinds of stuff. And so if they actually were practicing Jews, they could not hide the fact that they were Jews, because that would eventually be discovered. So what does that tell us as we're looking at this? What it's telling us is that we have some individuals that were not necessarily following the law completely. Esther being one of them. But understand that in her defense, if Mordecai wasn't following, then again, this shows you the pattern. If he's not, he's responsible for what she learns and she does, and she's under his control, then that would be where there would be, a breakdown.
But in his household, he could have been following it. He didn't have to eat here with the non-Jews, or that be known. Likewise, with her, it's a bigger problem.
Yep.
Now she's under the care of.
Exactly. But see, as you see, one of this, Mordecai already knows she's going. And so he's telling her, don't let anybody know you're a Jew. Which means that, like you said, she has even a bigger problem, because even if there was some practicing, she now is under the scrutiny of the king's servants, and trying to keep all that hidden is going to be hard. Who knows? The Bible doesn't let us know, but it does let us know that they're keeping their nationality hidden. In verse 11, it says, every day Mordecai took a walk in front of the harem's courtyard to learn how Esther was doing and to see what was happening to her. During the year before each young woman's turn to go to the king, Ahasuerus, the harem regulation required her to receive beauty treatments with oil of myrrh for 6 months, and then perfumes and cosmetics for another 6 months. And when the young woman would go to the king, she was given whatever she requested to take with her from the harem to the palace. She would go in the evening, and in the morning she would return to the second harem under the supervision of Sheshgaz, the king's eunuch in charge of the concubines. So notice that it changes. It goes from this harem is those young girls who are virgins, but once they go to the king, they now go to a different harem, which now is part of the concubines. She never went to the king again unless he desired her and summoned her by name. And so that's what we're saying. This was what these girls had to look forward to. They would go through all this treatment. They would have that one night. And if the king had them, but he wasn't really impressed, they just didn't wow him. Then the morning, they went to the other harem where the concubines would stay, and the only time they would ever leave that is if the king summoned them. That's it. That was their life. Now, this is where we come to Esther. Now, Esther was the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had adopted her as his own daughter. And when her turn came to go to the king, she did not ask for anything except for what Hegai, the king's trusted official in charge of the harem, suggested. Esther won approval in the sight of everyone who saw her. So again, we see this verse. And what happens is that Esther is doing what she's supposed to be doing. She's being obedient. She's already found favor with the chief eunuch. And now, instead of going and say, I need to take this with me, she waits for him to suggest what she needs to take. But she has gained favor with everyone. Now, that's a key statement, because if you have all these girls that are all going in there and they're hoping that they're going to be queen, there's a lot of competition. But everybody liked Esther. Everybody liked Esther. Now, verse 16, Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus in the royal palace in the 10th month, in the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. So see, he's already reigned 7 years. So there's been a lot of time that has taken place since he's made his plans to go to battle. He's set aside Vashti. Now they're going through all this for these girls. And so now she is there. Verse 17, the king loved Esther more than all the other women. Now, don't necessarily interpret that means that he now has a super, relationship with her. It just means that she wowed him more than all the rest of them, and that she stood out. And so, as a result of that, she won. The king loved Esther more than all the other women. She won more favor and approval from him than did any of the other virgins. And he placed the royal crown on her head and made her queen in place of Vashti. And the king held a great banquet for all his officials and staff, and it was Esther's banquet. And he freed his provinces from tax payments and gave gifts worthy of a king's bounty. Now, this is also another one of those interesting statements that tells us, because going back to what Brother Isaiah is pointing out, this guy is not really smart. I mean, I know you need to celebrate, but he has suspended taxes. He just got finished waging war. He's lost his navy. He's lost his army. He just got finished spending a whole lot of money on all these these virgins and having all their beauty treatments all done and all the other stuff that goes on for running the kingdom. And he turns around and now we're going to have a celebration and we're just going to cancel taxes. Yeah, he was a party dude. Yep, he definitely was. I mean, that's all he wanted to do. That's all he thought about. And that does not make a good leader. So anyhow, you have this, and this is what has happened. And so she now is queen. God has made sure that she has made the position where she is queen. She is in position now that as we look at the rest of the story, she's there to help her people. But going back to what Dreamer was saying, where she read that it didn't look like Esther was around very long. There's a good possibility she may not have been. Because as we walk in there, such a time as this, that's what it is. Her role, her purpose was that she needed to be in the position to where she could talk to the king and have the most influence to be able to work at preserving her people, which God was going to preserve his people so that his plan continued to move forward and his son would come into the world. So we look at verse 19. When the young women were assembled together for a second time, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, and Esther still had not revealed her birthplace or her ethnic background as Mordecai had directed. She obeyed Mordecai's orders and always had while he raised her. So again, we see that there was that relationship, and she followed everything that he basically told her she needed to do. So what we see about Esther is Esther is very obedient. Whoever's in charge, Esther's going to follow. They tell her to do this, is what's going to happen. Okay? Now, if we wrap this up in this chapter, it says in verse 21, during those days, while Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. Now, it's important that he's now sitting at the king's gate. Remember, he was having to walk by, the harem walls and see if he could hear something. But now that she is queen, he has been elevated. He's at the king's gate. The king's gate is like where all the court cases take place. This is where a major business takes place. This is an important place. And so he's now there. And so as he is there at the king's gate, Bigthan and Teresh, two eunuchs who guarded the king's interests, became infuriated and tried to assassinate King Ahasuerus. And when Mordecai learned of the plot, he reported to Queen Esther, and she told the king on Mordecai's behalf. And when the report was investigated and verified, both men were hanged on the gallows. And this event was recorded in the court records of daily events in the king's presence. So this is a very important section right here, because here's what's happened. Because I think there was a lot of people that wanted to assassinate this king because basically he wasn't too smart. He's cost the empire a lot of lives because it's obvious that he wasn't a very good military mind, because he lost the navy and he lost an army. These eunuchs, don't know how long they served, but they may have also been, taking care of Vashti, and they may not have liked the way that he handled Vashti, and so they may have just said, we've had enough of it, and here it is, Queen Esther now is coming into place, and so we just may go ahead and let's just wipe this guy out. Regardless of what they did, or why they did it, their plan was overheard. And as it was overheard by Mordecai, he lets Esther know. And Esther, in turn, lets the king know. Now, also notice we learned something too. As it is brought up, there's an investigation. The investigation proves that there truly was this plot, and then these two guys are executed. And for our purposes, we need to remember that they're executed, but Mordecai is recorded in the logs, in the history of that day, that he is the one who reported the assassination attempt. That's going to come back and work in his favor later in the book. So that's the other reason why it's there. So now what we have is we now have the king, we have Queen Esther, and we now have her cousin Mordecai, who is now part of this whole story. We got one more person that we're going to add, and that person starts in verse 1 of chapter 3. And after all this took place, so again, all this takes place, King Ahasuerus honored Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, and he promoted him to the rank and gave him a higher position than all the other officials. Now, we're going to stop right there and we're going to talk about this guy, because this guy is going to be the next player in this big story, and he is a big player. Part of it is because he wanted to be a big player. It doesn't say why he got promoted, it just says he got promoted. But looking at the king, and as we continue to look at Haman's character, what you're going to find is that Haman pretty much is one of those guys who knows how to talk a real good game. In fact, one of the things that we see about him, let me, if we turn to Proverbs 6. In Proverbs 6, we're going to see that this pretty much is going to describe Haman. Verses 16 through 19. Proverbs chapter 6, verse 16 through 19. 6 things the Lord hates. In fact, 7 are detestable to him: arrogant eyes, a lying tongue, hands that shed innocent blood, a heart that plots wicked schemes, feet eager to run to evil, a lying witness who gives false testimony, and one who stirs up trouble among brothers. Remember these things, because as we walk through, this is the description of Haman. This is the description of Haman. The other thing that we see that gives us description is that he is an Amalekite, basically being a descendant of Agag, who was king, and that was where we talk about Saul. So if you go to 1 Samuel chapter 15. 1 Samuel chapter 15. In verse 1 it says, Samuel told Saul, the Lord sent me to anoint you as king over his people Israel. Now listen to the words of the Lord. This is what the Lord of the hosts says. I witnessed what the Amalekites did to the Israelites when they opposed them along the way as they were coming out of Egypt. Now go and attack the Amalekites and completely destroy everything they have. Do not spare them. Kill men and women, children and infants, ox and sheep, camels and donkeys. And that was what he was told to do. And so he gets all his army gathered up. And Verse 7 says, Then Saul struck down at the Amalekites from Havilah all the way to Shur, which is next to Egypt, and he captured Agag, king of the Amalek, alive, but he completely destroyed all the rest of the people with a sword. And Saul and the troops spared Agag and the best of the sheep, cattle, and fatlings, as well as the young rams and the best of everything else. They were not willing to destroy them, but they did destroy all the worthless and unwanted things. Then the word of the Lord came to Samuel. I regret that I made Saul king, for he has turned away from following me and has not carried out my instructions. So Samuel became angry and cried out to the Lord all night. Early in the morning, Samuel got up to confront Saul, but it was reported to Samuel. Saul went to Carmel, where he set up a monument for himself, and then he turned around and went down to Gilgal. And when Samuel came to him, Saul said, May the Lord bless you. I have carried out the Lord's instructions. And Samuel replied, Then what is the sound of sheep and the cattle I hear? And Saul answered, The troops brought them from the Amalekites and spared the best sheep and the cattle in order to offer a sacrifice to the Lord your God. But the rest we destroyed. Stop, exclaimed Samuel. Let me tell you what the Lord said to me last night. Tell me. And Samuel continued, Although you were once considered yourself unimportant, have you not become the leader of the tribes of Israel? The Lord anointed you king over Israel and then sent you on a mission and said, Go and completely destroy the sinful Amalekites. Fight against them until you have annihilated them. So why didn't you obey the Lord? Why do you rush on to plunder and do what was evil in the Lord's sight? But I did obey the Lord, Saul answered. I went on a mission, and the Lord gave me, and I brought back Agag, king of Amalek, and completely destroyed the Amalekites. And the troops took the sheep and the cattle from the plunder and the best of what was a part of the destruction to go sacrifice the Lord your God at Gilgal. And so as you look at this story, it ends up showing you that Saul did not annihilate the Amalekites. Because he didn't do his part, guess what? We now have an Amalekite who's now in charge because the king has elevated him to that position. And so that is another one of those things that is there that we see. And so he naturally is going to be an enemy of God. And as we get ready to walk through chapter 3, we're going to see more of that. So next week, we'll look at chapter 3. We'll begin to start showing more of what he is doing. And then we'll begin to show the contention between him and Mordecai, and then what plan it leads to the destruction of the Jews. Okay? Questions?
My question is all the God has made, who was it that defeated him? Why did they go to his country?
Well, you'll see that in that part of history, a lot of times there was a lot of battles between the Greeks and the Persians. But at that time, the Greeks were splinters. They were different states. They were not, Alexander the Great is the first one who will come in, and he will gather all of them together as a fighting army. So that's one of the reasons why he could be defeated by a group, but they weren't big enough to come in and take over the whole empire. And that doesn't happen until Alexander the Great puts everything together, and then he does. Yeah. That's what's going on. Okay? Dreamer?
Yeah, the passage in 1 Samuel 15 makes it sound like all the Iraq had punished, and Agag was killed.
It makes it sound like that, but there were those who slipped through, because even when you get to David ends up killing the messenger who comes to say that Saul has been killed in battle. And he was Amalekite. So there were some that obviously did not get annihilated. He did not completely, he said he annihilated them all, but it's obvious that he did not do a thorough job of annihilating them all. He did what was easy. It's kind of like, I was picking up some material the other day, and you're supposed to go in and, get your material, and you're supposed to come out and they're supposed to check what you have. So I hand my ticket to the guy because I've already got my stuff, and he just looks at it. Did you get everything you needed? I said, yeah, I got all of it. He just scans my little thing, hands me back the paper, all right, have a nice day. And I'm going like, well, he actually was supposed to look in the back of my truck and count what I had, not just scan my ticket and say, okay, have a nice day. And basically what I said is that, he basically, you would like to think that it was because I have such an honest looking face and he just knew that I was honest and I didn't take any more than what I was supposed to. But in reality, what the problem was is he was lazy. He didn't want to go back there and he didn't want to have to count all that stuff in that big old high truck of mine. And that's what it was, especially when he was having to count, bricks. He didn't want to do it. Same thing happened with Saul. Saul was supposed to annihilate, but he was supposed to go thoroughly through the country and annihilate. He just basically hit all the high spots. And so therefore there were Amalekites that basically were not killed because we keep having them pop up throughout history. Oh, yeah. Yep. They can't get them all. All right. Let's go to the word of prayer. Our Heavenly Father, again, we just thank you for the day. Thank you for allowing us to be able to look at your word and help us to continue to have a love for your word and to apply it to our lives. Help us as we continue through the rest of this week, that we seize the opportunities you give us as we prepare for Sunday, as we once again meet to come and worship you. We ask all this in Jesus' name. Amen.
It's surprising how long these people hold a grudge.
Oh, yeah.
500 years.